So this week I got a random obscure sitcom that I presume, I certainly never heard of it, and I presume you have not either, but it was this guy, Random Lad on YouTube, who he's been kind of going through our archives a little bit, and he pitched out some ideas for like, hey, you could watch this, you could watch that. But this is the one that stood out to me because it's weird to me that I never heard of it. So he said, here's another obscure show for y'all, The Duck Factory. It stars Jim Carrey, and it won 2 Emmy Awards. So it could go either way on the quality scale. So I was like, because to me, Jim Carrey, super duper famous for my generation. From the sketch show In Living Color, he was Fire Marshal Bill. And then around 94, it went crazy. He was in The Mask and Dumb and Dumber and all this stuff. And nowadays, he's more of a fancy pants, so sort of the way like Robin Williams did, like moved into dramatic acting. He's kind of done the same thing, so I'm not as up on my Jim Carrey these days. But back in the 90s, he was so famous. And he's Canadian, and obviously we're Canadian. So I was just like, what the hell is the Duck Factory?
Never heard of it.
Yeah, I just presumed, not like I'm the world's biggest Jim Carrey fan, but back in those days, everybody was the world's biggest Jim Carrey fan. Or even when I lived in New York, so like 2008, 2009, I remember I was at a diner in Flushing, Queens, and Ace Ventura was on the TV. And I just hadn't seen it since the 90s. And it's just goddamn entertaining. I just ordered another piece of pie and I just sat there and watched the last half of Ace Ventura in this empty ass diner. And I was like, man, that guy is pretty good.
Well, and usually when somebody becomes famous like that, stuff that was in their past, I'm presuming this was in his past or his early beginnings, usually people comment on it or it comes to the surface, but I never heard of it.
Yeah, that's again where I'm so surprised. I guess I never thought about it. I just thought maybe he just started. I knew he was like a stand-up. So I guess it would make sense to go from stand-up comedy to a sketch show in Living Color, it's similar to when people get on SNL. I guess I just assumed that was probably his first thing, because that is not an unusual route for people to take in comedy. But yeah, there's stuff before that, and that's what this is. So, The Duck Factory is an American sitcom set at a small animation studio that aired on NBC in 1984 for 13 episodes. It was Jim Carrey's first lead role in a Hollywood production. So I went and looked him up a little because I've never looked into the early days of Jim Carrey. Quite harrowing. He's from Ontario. He grew up mostly in Scarborough, but there was a period where his family was basically homeless when he was a teenager, him and his brother. And, his dad lost his job and eventually got a job somewhere. I don't remember the details. It's all on Wikipedia. But part of the deal, this job that his dad got, they lived in company housing across the street from this big factory or whatever his dad worked at. And part of the deal was that Jim and his brother had to pitch in as security guards, on the graveyard shift. These teenagers had to go look after the building. Definitely, you hear stories about people who, we didn't have a lot of money growing up or whatever, but literal homelessness you don't hear about as often. But that's what happened with the Carrey family. But then he got into stand-up and pretty quickly caught on in Toronto. By the time he was 19, he was pretty famous in Toronto. But and I'll show you, actually let me show you this right now. He was in his very first thing was a CBC made-for-TV movie about an impressionist comedian trying to make it. And they're like, well, obviously, this guy's the guy. It had I don't remember the original name, but they renamed it to Rubberface later after Jim Carrey became famous because, he used to just always make funny faces. Let me just show you the trailer for this thing. This was 1981 when he was 19 years old. And this was a big success for CBC. It had 1 million viewers, which how many people do even live in Canada? 30 million? A lot of people were watching this damn thing. Oh, pay attention to this too, because he's still got a Canadian accent in this. There's this one line where he says, the sound of people laughing, the way he says laughing sounds so Canadian. It's the best sound in the world.
He was a struggling comedian.
Tony Maroney.
Waiting.
I want to be in showbiz.
For the right opportunity.
2 weeks from now, we're having another Battle of the Buffoons right here at Giggles.
It's going to be my first step to stardom.
With all the wrong jokes.
And what you get? Hot water. Thank you very much. You guys have been great.
Get some new material.
Maybe you can help me.
Somewhere between stage fright
I could never go on stage.
I'm scared too.
and friendship.
I'd like you to help me with my routine.
They discover what makes people
You
laugh.
should be looser, more relaxed.
What are you trying to say?
When the people laugh, it's the sweetest sound you could ever hear.
Jim Carrey, in a hilarious performance,
Help me prove I have a brain.
is Rubberface.
You've got to be kidding.
Yeah, that's what it was. When the people laugh, I can't even quite do it right, that Ontario. You know, we have our own Canadian accent, but that Ontario accent, like he eradicated that soon after. But so that was 1981, this made-for-TV movie thing in Canada, because he was doing great in Toronto, like selling out shows all the time and stuff. Then he tried going to Los Angeles to try to break into the American comedy scene, and apparently it just wasn't going as easily as it went in Canada. You know, he's just like almost on The Tonight Show, then he gets bumped off. He'd have some sets at some famous comedy places that just didn't go that well. But then in 1984, they gave him this job on this sitcom that got canceled after 13 episodes. And then he went back to Toronto, kept grinding comedy in Canada, slowly worked his way into America. And then by 1990, he got on In Living Color. And then by 94, you know, he's the biggest star in the world. So yeah, there's that whole 80s decade that I just never knew anything about. And it's essentially that Rubberface movie, which is on YouTube. It doesn't look terrible, but if anybody wants to watch it, the whole thing's on there. That was his Canadian debut. And this show, The Duck Factory, is his American debut. But as for this show, I started looking into it and I stopped immediately because it says, you know, like they said, it takes place at an animation studio. And the creators of this show worked on cartoons such as The Rocky and Bullwinkle Show, George of the Jungle, and Mr. Magoo, very famous cartoons. But this isn't a cartoon, this is a live action. So I was like, is this going to be like a Roger Rabbit thing? Is there going to be animation in this sitcom? Because otherwise, why are all these animation people involved in the show? But I decided I would rather not know. So I'm doing the thing where we're just going to go in blind and watch this thing. And then I'll look up some information after and see what the actual story was behind this show. But I didn't want to ruin it for myself because I truly don't know what the heck this is. And like I said at the start, I never heard of it. And yeah, I don't know, just maybe it seems extra weird to me because like one of his big famous movies back then was The Mask. And at that point, I was getting into comic books and I'd read the comic book of The Mask. And I was like, oh, I know what The Mask is. And no, Jim Carrey's going to be in The Mask. Like I knew enough Jim Carrey stuff that like I never heard anybody. It feels like this is from a different world. Like somebody went to a different alternate dimension and just got some Jim Carrey sitcom that we didn't have. Because
Well, let's check it out. And then it'd be interesting, the fellow that recommended it to you, it'd be interesting to find out how did he find out about this?
yeah, because the way he posted that message where he said it could go either way, maybe it was just him not wanting to take a stand, or maybe he hasn't seen it either. You know, I'm not sure. But yeah, I guess we're going to find out. So I've got episode 1 and episode 4. So we'll just watch those episodes. And yeah, man, mystery.
Okay, quack, quack, the Duck Factory. Let's...
Yeah, and if nothing else, I mean, I'm glad that I looked up those stories about the early days of Jim Carrey because it's interesting. And it's kind of a quintessential Canadian success story, too, in the sense of he had a much easier time here and America was hard to crack.
Oftentimes those stories, the struggle, when we see these people as famous people later, you think, oh yeah, they always had it easy, you know, and they got all this money now and they got all this fame. But those beginning stories are sometimes really fascinating because a whole lot of those people that become famous, it's kind of like the luck of the draw, and they really had to fight their way to the top or fight their way to the inner circle. And he sounds like he's one of those guys.
Yeah, it's one of those things.
Easy.
I mean, I haven't, again, like I said, I haven't really kept up with him, but modern day Jim Carrey, you know, he's a bit of a flake, to be honest with you. But, you know, he believes in, have you ever heard of The Secret? It's this like belief system that some lady wrote a book about where it's just basically visualizing. You visualize what you want and it comes true, which is, I mean, sure, you know, in a non-literal way, sure. I mean, why not? You have to see where you're trying to get to in order to get there. But The Secret takes it so far that they call it manifesting things, you know, like you just want it so bad that it literally like rearranges the atoms of the universe to give you what you want. It's a bit of nonsense. But he believes in that. But I'm not surprised in a way because his whole life was such a unbelievable, not that he didn't work hard, but like, again, 1 in a million out of 1 in a million to be as famous as that guy is. 1 out of a billion, you know? I mean, it helps you see why he would believe that there's something bigger going on. It's hard to believe that you just did that by yourself. You know, it must seem like the universe.
Right place, right time.
Yeah, like the universe manifested this life for me that I wished to have, and now I have it. Especially going from your family was recently homeless, and within like 5 years, you're the talk of Toronto. It's pretty crazy. It's going to scramble up people's brains for sure. No offense, Jim. Oh, that's kind of neat too. Just that he's the Canadian thing. His family is half French, and their name originally was Carrey, which is French for square. They changed it to Carey, but his real name's Jim Square, which is just weird. I've never heard that as a French last name before, but there you go. I guess Marie Curie is almost, but not quite Curie. It's
No,
Carrey.
Carré is a, but not spelled that way. C-A-R-R-E accent aigu.
Right.
Not C-A-R-E-Y. Maybe they changed the spelling too
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think they did.
to make it
just
very anglicized.
Right. Cool. But all right. So, and I believe these too. I mean, I found somewhere to get copies of these at slightly higher quality. But if you just wanted to watch them along, I believe these are on YouTube also because it's safe to say NBC does not give a fuck about the Duck Factory, the possibly most forgotten show of all time. like I still can't get over that. How I've never even in passing heard anybody even hint that they knew this thing existed. So here we go.
You never learn?
So, I mean, I would call that show weird, contrived, and tiresome. But I don't know, maybe you felt better about it.
Well, it's not the worst that I've seen,
Right?
but
I mean, I guess if you look at it from the perspective of a forgotten show that got canceled halfway through the first season, there's nothing surprising about that. Like, I guess it's that I really wonder about the initial development, like the ideas behind this show just seems so unclear and so weird. Like, what were they trying to accomplish? But anyway, so first off, where I was getting those weird ideas of like, is this going to have an animated duck or something in it? But then also I was getting my timeline mixed up a little. I thought Roger Rabbit was before this, but this was before Roger Rabbit. So no, it does not have that. It just has like little animated bits in the show. And the show just takes place at an animation studio. It kind of gives me the vibe of WKRP, except WKRP was cool because, they're like cool DJs and stuff. But this show is not cool. It's just weird. And so, yeah, and it gets made by animators. And Jim Carrey has all these impassioned speeches about how this is important. Cartoons are important to people. Animation matters and stuff. And it's like, obviously, these guys who have a history making Rocky and Bullwinkle and stuff, obviously they care about animation. But it's weird to think that a general audience would. Because
it's pretty standard for a whole lot of sitcoms that were of this era. It's really nothing special.
Right. And then from there, just the contrivances are wild. So Jim Carrey did fine, especially for such a young man, inexperienced or whatever. I mean, they gave him nothing to work with here, but he did a fine job. But he shows up at this animation studio because the guy promised to give him a job, but then he finds out that the guy who was going to give him the job has died. So, but it all works out, the new management, whatever. But the guy who owned the place had like a love den inside the studio with like a waterbed. So Jim Carrey's just going to live.
Mirrors on the ceiling.
Yeah. So Jim Carrey's just going to live there. That's his place because he doesn't have an apartment. So he literally lives in the studio. So that's pretty weird. And the new owner is, this ditzy blonde girl who met this guy who owned the studio 3 weeks earlier. She was a topless ice dancer or whatever. One of these archetypes that is very much of the 80s. Like, they just wouldn't fly anymore because it's kind of insulting. Just like there's this dumb lady who shows her boobs and is willing to marry somebody who she's just met. and now she happens to be, running the place. But then when we jumped ahead to episode 4, we missed obviously the origin of this, but one of the guys in the office, I guess presumably started dating this lady and then found out she was a prostitute. And she's the exact same archetype, but even more so. Like the other one was already over the top, but this one is even blonder, even dumber, and is actively still like, hey, it's lunch. My lunch is a busy time for me. And she goes out to jack people off or whatever the fuck she's doing.
Do business. She does business.
Yeah, because that's not so uncommon, especially at the time. They don't throw in these little spicy things for people to watch on TV, but it's usually more of the pretty woman thing of like, oh, it's my first day doing this job, or I did this job, but now that we're dating, I'm going to stop. This lady is actively a prostitute and is identical to the other ditzy blonde lady, where this just makes me wonder, like, these guys who made this show, this is where I'm so confused where they're coming from, is on the one end, they've got their love of animation and like, oh, let's just yammer on about the beauty of animation and how important animation is and how apparently working on animation is interesting. And on the other end, just casual misogyny, just put it all over the place. Let's just fill the show with it. So I just don't know what the fuck this show was supposed to be. But, I mean, it had kind of an interesting tone because it's not like a set 'em up, knock 'em down sitcom. It does have a laugh track, but the laugh track is kind of sparse because it's sort of half a drama. That's kind of an interesting idea, but it just doesn't work, I think it's safe to say.
I have nothing more to say other than it seemed to be pretty representative of what was being produced at that time for sitcom.
Yeah, and I guess the other little thing I looked up is it ran after Cheers. So I was like, oh man, that's a pretty prime spot. You think that would help? But this was the early days of Cheers, where Cheers was also not doing that well. And then Cheers later went on to become the #1 sitcom of the era. But that's a good example, I guess. If you want like a workplace sitcom, that maybe makes sex jokes and stuff, Cheers makes a lot more sense than The Duck Factory. What a truly weird show. But anyway, I thought let's throw in as a bonus, because again, this is like proto Jim Carrey, like just this weird false start to his career where he must have been like, I made it, I'm in LA, I got a job on a Hollywood sitcom, and then it got immediately canceled and he disappeared for the next 5 years back into the circuit of even the comedy. Like I was saying, he mostly was still in Toronto. He's still trying to make it in LA. So I thought, let's watch an episode of In Living Color, because that's where I first saw Jim Carrey. And it's just be interesting to watch because it's, it was a famous sketch show of the time. We've watched a bunch of sketch shows. And what I always remembered about In Living Color, it was Keenan Ivory Wayans, and like there's a million Wayans brothers. So they're the main core of this show. And it was like a Fox show, ran from 1990 to 94. And I always remembered Jim Carrey as the white guy on the show. I think he wasn't the only one, but almost the only one. Because most of this show, kind of what made it unique is that it was not a sketch show full of white guys. And I just looked up that apparently the name In Living Color, it's a take on how they used to introduce shows in the 60s when color TVs were first becoming more common. Such and such a show presented in living color, but also as a sort of secondary meaning of like, hey, look at us, we're black guys and we got a show. And this show was super popular, and it even says in the wiki page, I couldn't find specifically any information about how Jim Carrey got hired, so it just seems like he was just floating around still in the system and they just auditioned and hired him. But yeah, it's funny that they even mention like In Living Color helped launch the career of now famous Jim Carrey. So it's funny that this show from 4 or 5 years later, this was the launch, not The Duck Factory. Again, The Duck Factory, it's so weird. It's like we just watched a couple episodes. I did a little bit of research about it. It still feels like it didn't exist. Like it feels like we just watched a ghost of a show.
Yeah. It doesn't have anything really redeeming about it where you say, oh my God, that was good. Why did they cancel that?
Right.
It was just one of those shows, of which there were many being produced, and they really weren't all that good.
Right.
Nothing remarkable about it.
It kind of reminds me a little, maybe Wings was better, but Wings kind of reminds me of this a little in the sense that, again, it's still just a workplace sitcom, but Wings was like a small airport. And it's just weird that some stuff works and some stuff doesn't. Like WKRP works great. Cheers works great. The little animation studio, not so much. The small airport, not so much. There's just some jobs are interesting and some jobs aren't. I don't know. And again, yeah, I just feel like the Duck Factory, just truly confusing as to like, what is the tone? I would have thought, like, based on it being set in an animation studio and then including little random animatics and stuff in the show, like that kind of feels like it should be one of those out of this world, small wonder Saturday morning sitcom for kids. You know, like if they did a kid version of that, I could have seen watching that when I was a kid if it was like more about the cartoons. But instead, it's set in a cartoon studio, but it's all about hookers. And it's just like, what a weird show. So, so for In Living Color, to finish this off with, the more mature career of Jim Carrey, or like when he really sparked off, I got season 2, episode 14, that is called Introducing Fire Marshal Bill. And yeah, when I was a kid, man, everybody loved Fire Marshal Bill. This is famous as crap. So I figured let's watch that and, finish this off on surely a more interesting
high note, hopefully.
Yeah. So yeah, that's definitely
That's a little different.
much more fun to watch. And that's like a weird time warp too. It's so, like I was saying when it first started, that there's that weird period in the very early 90s where all the grunge stuff hadn't happened yet, or gangsta rap or whatever, like all the harsh weirdness of the mid 90s. But it wasn't the 80s either. It was just this kind of day glow, super colorful version of the 90s. That it was a weird time. But it is kind of cool to see that too, because even just that, instead of like how SNL has a musical act or whatever, these guys have the Fly Girls, and they really make a big deal of it. Here's the new Fly Girl. Let's watch the Fly Girls dance. And it's just all that stuff that is so dated now, but it's kind of cool to go back to.
And it's more like the Jim Carrey that we know, who became the famous Jim Carrey. That's very reminiscent of, or representative of who he was, whereas that earlier show that we watched, the acting was good, but there was nothing remarkable about him, whereas in this you can see that ability has to take on various characters and that rubber face, real rubber face.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, that it is kind of weird, like the Duck Factory really is kind of the odd man out, because even that really old CBC TV movie they renamed a rubber face, and he was doing impressions and stuff back then. So yeah, it's weird that they had him be so milquetoast in the other show. But yeah, Fire Marshal Bill, holy crap, like there is some makeup to make it look like half of his head got kind of burned, but a lot of that is just him. Those teeth I was mentioning, like, oh, there's those big Jim Carrey teeth, that you just remember. But all he has to do is jut his head out, put his jaw back a little, and then they're like so big, like it looks like makeup, but it's not. It's just the way he's got one eye kind of closed, and yeah, it's like almost scary. Because Fire Marshal Bill, his whole thing, like it's the stupidest thing in the world, but he's supposed to teach you about fire safety, but he always lights things on fire when he's doing that. And by the end, like he's burned down this family's whole house, and he's been on fire, and he's all fucked up looking, and he's like sees another house to go to, and it has like the feeling of a horror movie almost.
Yeah, he's going next door to burn the wooden shingles off that house.
Yeah, and it is like incredibly dumb, but watching it again, I'm like, yeah, I can remember why when I was 12 that was so funny. Like it's still pretty funny now, but as a kid, that's like the best thing ever. But then it's funny too, like the sketch after that, which was also pretty good in its own right, where Damon Wayans is just this fucking party clown who doesn't give a fuck. And he's like leading the kids in a little song that eventually devolves into how the government's keeping him down and society can go to hell and all this stuff. But even in that, Jim Carrey plays like a scoutmaster, but very similar mannerisms. And seeing these old Jim Carrey stuff, because also, the mask was all about that, this like, magical mask that makes him all special powered, but his face is kind of like that anyway. And Dumb and Dumber is the ultimate example, where the whole joke is that those characters are incredibly dumb. So seeing these old Jim Carrey things, it reminds me of that mid-2000s. Like, there was this movie called Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind in 2004, I think. That was like the first big Jim Carrey dramatic vehicle. And like he eventually got it over, probably by like 98 with like Man on the Moon. People were more or less taking him seriously. But talk about a hard hill to climb to start getting serious jobs when you're famous for being the rubber face guy. Because he's so silly in these old things, but he's so good at it.
It was interesting to see Jim Carrey from the early days. And we watched him transition from the character we know when we watched the show in Toronto. Then we moved to simple drama kind of thing, where he was very, nothing special. He wasn't bad acting, but there was nothing special about it. But then that Living Color show, that's where you really see him come to the character that obviously he is. And he does an excellent job at playing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it is probably for the best, too, for his overall career, that he moved into more serious stuff. But yeah, because it's almost like maybe it's, saying Fire Marshal Bill is the role he was born to play. Like, maybe that is kind of pigeonholing him into too small of a category. But seeing it back, it really is. There's again, I'm going to bring up The Simpsons. Every time there's a Simpsons reference. But there's this one Simpsons episode about Lisa when she's an adult. And she's dating this fancy pants Hugh Grant guy who, they're both obviously fancy pants intellectuals, but their favorite actor is Jim Carrey. And Lisa's like, he can make you laugh with nothing but a wild flailing of his limbs. Which is like...
Well said.
Yeah,
well said.
On the one hand, that's a way of saying like he's kind of just got a dumb act. But on the other hand, if it was that easy to do, everybody would do it. Like you do have to have, even for that, a kind of weird aptitude.
He strikes me like when you see clowns in a circus and everything seems so easy and effortless for them. But really, those guys to pull that off and do those antics that they do takes a lot more effort and talent than sometimes somebody who's just doing straight drama. Jim Carrey's like that. Although it looks effortless to take on those facial movements and those limb movements, that must take a lot of practice and forethought. And I mean, it just doesn't come naturally to people like that. There's thought behind that. And those people are probably more talented than people who do straight drama or who just play themselves when they do acting. And people say, oh, isn't he great? But there's so many actors that you see that, especially stars, and they always play themselves.
Right.
I don't know that that's real talent. Real talent is somebody who can do what he does, Carrey, and make you laugh and make it appear as if it was so easy. But I don't think it is that easy.
Yeah, because even in Fire Marshal Bill, not only his performance, but the whole setup, very elaborate. There's a lot of, there's literal fires. He lit his hand on fire for that. Like, damn, you don't want to mess that up. But yeah, and it's also interesting, even though, like the Duck Factory didn't do much for me as a show, but again, just even as an excuse to watch Living Color again, but also just to dive into it a bit, because, like I said, I just assumed he appeared out of nowhere in Living Color. Somehow that's where he started. So it's kind of neat to know that he was grinding it out in Canada since he was like 17. Yeah, he's like 12 years into the business before in Living Color when he started, quote unquote.
Yeah.
So, that's kind of
sometimes we get this impression that these people just walked in off the street somewhere and started to do this stuff. But they didn't. This is a building block. Obviously, this guy's been at this for, 12, 13 years by the time he starts on that and really starts to show what he's capable of doing. I think guys who do comedy and do real good comedy are extremely talented, and I don't think people give them enough credit for it because they do it. It looks so effortless for them.
Man, it's a terrifying endeavor too. I've only done a bit of stand-up comedy in my life, but it's just you. Like, there's no one else to take the blow. If it doesn't go well and nobody thinks it's funny, it's not like you're part of a writing team or you're part of an ensemble. It's just you. It feels pretty bad. So yeah, kudos to all the comedians out there. You guys are you're some brave motherfuckers.